real thing, come to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago.
Well, as a young country, though, there was certainly no, you could say that there's no military tradition to the United States. Some of that had to be imported. Where did the early organizers, people like Scott, get their import their military tradition?
There is a tradition, but the fundamental problem is the tradition is this idea that this sort of the Minuteman myth, that Americans don't need training. When there's a crisis, they'll all rally to the flag, pick up their shotguns and their fowling pieces, and go to repel the invader. And the reality is, wars don't really work that way. And the War of 1812 really shows that this is not an effective means of doing this. So what these early officers have to do is import what are essentially European models, mostly from France, because this is, I mean, the poor French have gotten a terrible reputation after 1870 and World War II. But France in the post-Napoleonic period was still considered the great martial country, and Americans had connections with France from the Revolution. So officers, Sylvanus Thayer, for example, who's so crucial in this sort of foundation of the Thayer system at West Point, he goes to France, buys lots of books, visits French officers, installations, talks to them, takes much of the French curriculum at the Polytechnique and brings it back to West Point, and then kind of makes a American version of this French model. So most of these models are by necessity imported from Europe, because the reality is the American Army is by comparison, a provincial, underfunded, not terribly effective force. So they, in the same way that other countries, at least of friendly countries, come to the United States to get this expertise now, you know, why we have exchange midshipmen from other friendly countries at the Naval Academy, the U.S. sends officers abroad.
Yeah, they had exchange, they sent officers for exchange at the time. Joe, how about your army in terms of, by your army, I mean the Army of Northern Virginia, but Lee's army.
Yeah, I owned it.
Yeah, as a topic, you seem to own it right now. They also came from a particular culture, if you would put it a certain way. But I mean, the Confederacy is starting an army from scratch. Obviously, they have access to a lot of the expertise that Wayne talks about. But also, what's the cultural root of Lee's army that you find by looking at the enlisted men?
That's a great question, because of course these are citizen soldiers, so they come from society and they reflect the values and culture of society. And in modern times we send people into boot camp so that we break down and then rebuild. Now we don't banish all elements of civilian society, and it creeps in, and anyone who serves in the military today will openly admit that. But the reality is that you create a military culture. One of the problems the Confederacy had was the way that the Army was formed, and the quick thrust into combat and the lack of kind of structure developed resulted in a culture being created from the bottom up instead of the top down. And so when Lee came in, there were all these practices and behaviors that he wanted to banish, but the culture was already so well ensconced that it was a continual battle for the rest of the war. And he would urge his subordinate officers to crack down on certain types of behavior, destruction or lack of preservation of vital war materials. The Confederacy didn't have a bottomless pit. Even things like wooden barrels, they had to recycle. You couldn't have soldiers breaking them up, because they didn't have the manpower to continually make barrels, whereas the Union had that capacity. So Lee was trying to get soldiers to conserve valuable supplies and things of that nature, to conduct themselves in certain ways. They were fighting an enemy that had vastly superior resources and manpower. And so it was critical that the Confederacy protect their limited margin for error in manpower and supplies, things like that. And so that's one of the great battles that Lee has during the course of his tenure as commanding general.
Right, trying to instill a military ethos, I suppose.
That's right. And of course, the soldiers are superb fighters, but in other regards, there's a lack of discipline that's problematic, because they come from civilian society, and Southern society promoted individualism and individual problem solving, taking care of matters. So if the Army isn't going to feed the soldiers properly, the soldiers are going to take matters into their own hands, which means they're going to plunder nearby farms, steal from Army wagons, steal from Army trains, and that creates more and more difficulty.
Right.
Just, if I could, what part of my book deals with is this tension, because Joe's absolutely right. So you have this problem with these regular Army guys, who try to take this model and impose it, but the material they're trying to impose it is resistant in many ways.
Yeah.
And there's an incompatibility there. And a lot of times that causes profound tensions. I mean, you can also make the argument, I think, that a lot of times these most successful West Pointers are the ones who figure out a way of dealing with that, of making it maybe a creative, actually an effective tension. And I don't think you can really have, these books I think are very complementary in the sense that you can't have a complete picture unless you have both sides. So my approach is very bureaucratic, institutional, but it's crucial to recognize that social basis. These are profoundly citizen-soldier armies on both sides.
Right, and I don't know if we want to plunge deeper into this topic, but that's been a topic of other people have written about whether or not a truly professional European style professional army could have been imposed on either of these cultures, even if they wanted to.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be accepted by the soldiers themselves. The Southern soldiers are imbued with sense of honor, and a culture that makes them resistant to being lorded over, ordered about, and so on, because that infringes on their rights. And anyone who's in that situation, if you don't have your rights, then you were a slave.
Right.
And so they're very sensitive to this sort of thing. And as a result, and of course, most of the officers are from the community, so they've known these individuals all their lives.
Now, you mentioned, Joe, the scope of your survey in the introduction. 600 soldiers divided between 300 infantry, 150 artillery, and 150 cavalry. And at some point, maybe in another question, I want to come back and talk about the statistics of that. But first, I want to give you a chance to tell us, having looked at this sample, representative sample of Confederate soldiers, but not just Confederate soldiers, but General Lee's soldiers, was there one or two surprises? Was there one or two things that you found out you were wrong from your initial look at, your initial idea versus what you found out after looking at the data?
I don't think it was so much what I thought was wrong. There were surprises, though. The high percentage of slaveholders, or soldiers who came from slaveholding families. About 38%, 37.5% came from slaveholding families, whereas only 24.9% of all Southern families had slaves. And then also, 4 of every 9 soldiers, 44.4% of all the soldiers came from slaveholding households. I'm sorry, I said 24.9% came from slaveholding households.
Right.
A little under 20% came from slaveholding families in all the South. So what you have is a tremendous overrepresentation of slaveholders. Why is that? It's basic demographics. Richer families had more children, therefore they had more sons to serve the Confederacy. And so as a result, you didn't have so much a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. You had a rich man's war, but a rich man's, poor man's, middle class man's fight. And actually the group that's most underrepresented is the middle class. Why? Because so many of them are skilled workers, and society needs those skilled workers to produce for the armies.
So you're finding the middle class is underrepresented?
Underrepresented, yeah.
Right.
Now the total wealth that I use to determine classes is granted flexible. I mean, we don't have any hard and fast numbers that we would use to determine that. But I circulated the numbers to other people, and I have very extensive research experience in the time period, and so I think the numbers I set, in conjunction with some other advice, are probably reasonably accurate.
Okay.
So, in other words, when we're dealing with class, it makes sense.
So to some extent, I guess to some extent what you're finding is that Bell Wiley's Johnny Reb is a little bit different than sometimes, maybe, I'm sure Wiley got it right, but
Yeah.
the way he's portrayed in popular imagination is probably a little
Yeah,
little different, in fact.
that's right. These people tend to be wealthier, and of course, the older soldiers tend to be wealthier, because of course they've been out working, establishing families. And then a lot of the soldiers are still living with their parents.
Mhm.
So their wealth is reflected in their parents. They haven't moved out yet, and those people tend to come from wealthier families as well. So you have a kind of bifurcated situation.
Now, what we're going to do here, at virtual book signing, we always take a look at original documents and manuscripts and things like that. That's what we do. We're an antiquarian bookshop. But we also want to give our scholars a chance to look at some of the things and comment on them. First thing we're going to look at today is something that I'm going to ask you about, Joe. To some extent, this is an easy answer. This is a cover, an envelope signed by Jeb Stewart to his wife. But what we're going to look at there is the printing on the envelope. It comes from the Army of the Potomac. Of course, the Army of the Potomac early in the war was the name used to describe the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia, but not yet called the Army of Northern Virginia. But Joe, if you could comment on to what extent was this Army of the Potomac well established by the time Lee came along and made it Lee's Army? What kind of army did he inherit from people like Johnston and Beauregard?
Lee inherited a good fighting army, but one that was rather undisciplined, and one that didn't husband supplies effectively and suffered shortages. Bureaucratically, it didn't function very well, and as a result, there were shortages throughout the army. So one of the most extraordinary aspects of the book, one of the things that I learned, and I was really surprised, was how effectively Lee took charge, but not so much in the way people would think. When Lee was appointed, the soldiers weren't necessarily enthusiastic about him.
Mm-hmm.
It was only after he fought so well at the Peninsula, and then shortly thereafter, second Manassas campaign, and the next thing you know, the army's in Maryland, and then everybody realizes, my God, in the course of 3 months, this guy's turned the war around for us in the East. But what Lee was really good was preparing the army to fight in the 7 days. And that really surprised me. So you go through Lee's orders, and there's a subtle name change. It slowly works its way in. Suddenly it's the Army of Northern Virginia, not the Army of the Potomac. He cracks down on discipline issues. He cracks down on efforts to waste supplies. He forces soldiers to dig in. The soldiers resent it, and Lee doesn't care because they don't know what he's going to do. And what Lee's going to do, of course, is throw 3/4 of his army on the Union flank, right, where 1/4 is going to hold the rest of the Union army at bay, and they need to be well entrenched, right, nicely secured. He gathers information. He forces the soldiers to dig, to make abattis and all sorts of other things to secure their positions. He streamlines supplies so that the soldiers are properly fed. He orders his officers to make sure that the soldiers are well rested. He wants a well-rested, well-fed, strong army ready to fight. And so he does a great job of that in the course of less than a month.
Is this the same time period, or did you notice by looking at the soldiers, in the same time period, do they take to Lee? Do they start to identify themselves as Lee's army after that month?
No.
Or does that take some more time?
No, the soldiers don't really react to Lee very much. You seldom see Lee mentioned in their letters during that previous month. But then all of a sudden what happened was, during the 7 days battles, all the newspapers give credit to people like Jackson, Johnston. Even Johnston's wounded, he's not even there, and they're giving credit to Johnston. And Lee is on a level with Johnston, but all sorts of other individuals are being given credit. And then all of a sudden, one of the officers, he's clearly not high-ranking, writes a letter into one of the Richmond newspapers and chastises the newspapers for missing what should be obvious, that the success is predicated on Lee, not on anyone else. And that begins an outpouring of the newspapers. They come to the realization that all these reporters and all these authors who are submitting information to the newspapers have a political agenda, and the agenda doesn't include elevating Robert E. Lee
Right.
to any lofty status. And the newspapers come to the realization, and then of course they begin investigating, and when soldiers' letters start getting home, the soldiers can see what's obvious. That is, in the course of 7 days, they may have suffered heavy losses, but they overran the Union Army and drove them 20 miles back.
Yeah.
And so in their minds, this was an incredible achievement. And Richmond was saved. I mean, remember, the Confederates were back up against Richmond. The Union
Yeah.
could see church spires from their positions. They were that close to Richmond.
And they went from there to
Suddenly-
Maryland.
Yep,
and-
suddenly Jackson's detached and heads up north, and then Longstreet's wing is detached, is pulled out too, and we have the Battle of Second Manassas, and then ultimately into Maryland. And of course, also in that campaign, they captured the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, which is the single largest capture of Union soldiers in the Civil War.